A very good evening to all of you. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 21st JGLS Alumni webinar on the topic of advocacy for social justice, tools, techniques, and challenges by a distinguished alumna, Ms. Yashaswini Mittal. I'm Professor Shireen Moti, Assistant Professor of Law and Director of Alumni Relations at OP Jindal Global University. OP Jindal Global University was started in the year 2009 under the visionary leadership of our Chancellor, Mr. Naveen Jindal, and our Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar. In a span of over a decade, OP Jindal Global University has been recognized as an institute of eminence by the Government of India, and Jindal Global Law School has been ranked as the #1 law school in India by QS World Rankings. Before I welcome our outstanding speaker for today, I would like to introduce her briefly. After graduating with the BA LLB Honours degree from Jindal Global Law School in the year 2014, Ms. Yashaswini Mittal worked for 3 years with the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy in India, where she analysed regulatory issues in the areas of public health and environment protection. She later obtained an LLM in Global Health Law from Georgetown University Law Center, Washington, D.C., where her work focused on public interest advocacy, public health law and policy, and international human rights law. Subsequently, she undertook short-term assignments with two leading advocacy organizations, namely the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Reproductive Rights in New York. Ms. Mittal is currently based in South Sudan on an assignment with the United Nations. While advocacy as a term is used very often in the legal profession, law students and young lawyers often know little about what it entails. Through this webinar, Ms. Mittal hopes to shed some light on the basics of public interest advocacy and its utility in the practice of public interest law. With this, I welcome Ms. Yashaswini Mittal. We are delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. And I hope that the viewers of this webinar find the topic and what we discuss in this webinar interesting. So thank you so much for having me.
We're at the most a lot delighted to have you with us here today, and we are looking forward to hearing your expert views on the topic that is decided for today. A word to the attendees that Ms. Mittal is in South Sudan right now, and she is facing a lot of connectivity issues, as you do face in a career in international human rights law, and as a public interest individual as she is. So there might be time lags in this webinar, but we will keep you informed and we will make sure that you get all the information that you need. So before we get into the substantive topic for today, we would really like to know more about your journey from a law student to a lawyer. How did you shape yourself into this professional lawyer that you are? So my first question to you in that regard, Yashaswini, really is that what were your reasons of choosing to pursue a career in law?
Thanks, Shireen, for the question. So I initially wanted to be a doctor, actually, not a lawyer when I was in school. I wanted to be a pediatrician, actually. However, along the way in school, I realized that I was not really good at science and I couldn't really do well in the subject. And in fact, instead, I enjoyed history, civics, and economics more. So after school, I decided to pursue economics initially for a year at a college in Bangalore. And when I was in Bangalore, I came in contact with a lot of law students who were studying in the same college, but in the law department. And they were doing a lot of human rights and social justice related work. And after speaking with them and seeing the immensely interesting work that they were doing, I realized that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I decided to drop out of my economics degree and start preparing for law entrance exams. So I think that was like the transition in my life, that from economics, I decided to go for law. Yeah.
You really pursued your interest, and that is something that you keep telling young people as well, right? That you should pursue your interest and everything else will fall into place. And as a young student, you had that vision for yourself, and that is remarkable in itself to take those decisions at that age. So what role did Jindal Global Law School actually play in your journey from becoming this law student who is, just coming into this world, experiencing, making friendships, knowing about the law, to becoming a successful lawyer today? Yes, Yashaswini. Okay, attendees, I think we've lost Yashaswini for a few seconds. She'll be back on. Uh, as I said, she's facing connectivity issues.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, Yashaswini, we can hear you. Should I repeat that question for you? Hello. Okay, facing a few issues with the internet, and she'll be back on in a few seconds. So let's wait for her to log in back.
Hello.
Yes, 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 Yashaswini.
Hi. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's all
Yeah. So
right.
to answer, I heard your question. So to answer you, so I think I consider myself really lucky to have joined the Jindal Global Law School in its inaugural batch in 2009, and I think Shireen, you would agree, like since we were batchmates and we joined in 2009, that JGLS played a very important role in our personal and professional development. And because we were the inaugural batch, we had the opportunity to establish student societies and initiate our junior batches into different student societies, and also just get the chance to be enterprising and follow through with things in law school. So I think that was really instrumental in my development as a lawyer and someone who has to be persistent with any issue or initiative that I take up. Second, I think I got a lot of amazing opportunities at JGLS, pretty much everything I had hoped for. I joined law school, like I said, with the aim of becoming a human rights lawyer and to have a career with the United Nations. And through JGLS, I was able to get 2 internships with UNHCR and the UN Criminal Court for Rwanda in Arusha, which allowed me to get a sneak peek into my future career with the United Nations. So I'm grateful for these opportunities as well. And lastly, I think I appreciated the mentorship and guidance I received from all the professors at JGLS, who always told us not to limit ourselves in the careers we wanted to pursue after law school, and always encouraged us to think out of the box. So yes, I think
Beautifully summed
JGLS was
up.
definitely very, yeah.
You're speaking from your heart, and I, as a fellow batchmate and a friend, of course, I can understand where you're coming from, because we're part of that unique experience, and only we can understand what it was like being in the inaugural batch, and the kind of professors we had and the kind of opportunities we got. But of course, we really worked hard for them, and the internships that you're talking about are really the dream internships for any law student in India. And certainly they must have given you a good starting point in terms of understanding whether this was meant for you or not. And the experience itself, looking back, might seem truly remarkable to you from a young law student's perspective. And similar experiences are something that I had in my area, and thankful to the university for that. So
Yeah.
when it came to your career choices, I know from the beginning that you had this mindset that you wanted to work in a particular area, do a particular kind of work, and you did not compromise in any step, and one can see it throughout your journey. But straight out of law school, and I vividly remember the time when we were deciding what is it that we should choose as our first job, and you chose Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, which was up and coming at that point, and the idea of something like that was truly new in those times. So we're not that old, but 6, 7 years back, it was still
Yeah.
upcoming. Today, it's widely known. So, what made you take that decision? How was the time well spent at Vidhi or not for you?
Sure. So actually, I was informed about Vidhi by a professor at JGLS. When I was in my fifth year, I knew that I didn't want to join a law firm or be a litigator in my first job. However, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do either. Like, I think I was not aware of like what other options I had available to me right out of law school. So my professor suggested that, I look at a career in public policy and research. And I didn't even know what public policy, research, advocacy, what all of this meant at the time. But the professor shared this fellowship opening at Vidhi, and he said that perhaps you should apply here and see if you get in and explore this area. And so I applied, and I got in, and it was definitely the best decision of my life, because Vidhi was also a new organization when I joined, just like JGLS was, a new law school. And I received a lot of guidance and mentorship from my seniors at Vidhi, through which I was able to improve my legal writing and research. And gradually, as I grew in the organization, I was able to conceptualize and formulate projects, which was also a great learning experience for me and prepared me for, my future assignments. So definitely, it was one of the best experiences working with Vidhi.
That sounds wonderful, and probably that made you decide to go on and pursue your master's in a very specialized area of global health law at Georgetown University. Firstly, the choice of master's is something which is quite different from usually what students would like to do. They would like to do arbitration or public international law. Those are the two popular choices for anybody who's doing a master's abroad. So I think maybe your work at Vidhi Center influenced that kind of a decision, or what was it that made you decide that you wanted to do global health law as your master's specialization, and choosing, of course, Georgetown is amazing, but why at Georgetown?
Sure. So like you correctly mentioned, when I was at Vidhi, I worked on health and environmental law. And through that, I cultivated an interest in public health and environmental law. And I found, and I think all of us will believe this now after COVID-19, that public health affects us in different ways. And it's cross-cutting. It's a cross-cutting subject that affects all the different areas of laws. It affects access to justice, criminal law, prison reform, everything. So I realized that early on that public health is really interesting and it's a cross-cutting subject, which is why I wanted to study it further, but look at it from a legal lens. Georgetown is the only university which offers a specialized LLM in global health law. And they also had substantial scholarship, which was available to students who wanted to pursue this particular LLM, which is why I decided to apply and then attend Georgetown University. And again, Georgetown also has Larry Gostin as one of its senior professors, and Larry Gostin is like an authority in the field of global health law. So again, it was a great experience to get a chance to interact with Professor Gostin and attend his classes, and again get the exposure that I did in public health and global health. Yeah.
Seems like you had an amazing experience, and a lot of research went into deciding which university, what kind of scholarships, and it's a good, information for the students that it takes work to get into the master's program of your choice. But if you put in sufficient mind to it, you can get there, as you did.
Definitely.
So. Finally, you have been working at your dream organization, which is the United Nations, and that is something that you started the thought of doing law with, that you wanted to ultimately end up at the UN. So, how is it like now? What is the experience now when you are there facing all of those things that we sort of read about in international human rights law, facing those challenges? Of course, it is a career choice which is emotionally taxing, so to speak, as opposed to other fields, because you're dealing with humans in a very direct way, um, and uh, and in situations which are unbearable and unhappy and all of those things, and not ideal at all. So how do you manage those situations and manage yourself while at the UN?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I think, I've been working with the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan for the past 1 year, about more than a year. It's been an absolutely fabulous experience. Like you have said, it is a dream come true for me. I work in the rule of law advisory section, where we basically work with justice sector and security sector actors on different initiatives within the country in these two sectors. It's really interesting and meaningful work. Of course, there are some challenges, but I think as a human rights lawyer and having worked in different organizations across the globe now, I feel like you need to find ways to keep yourself motivated. And I think when you interact with people in different capacities, and they invest so much faith in you, they tell you their stories, and they trust you with their stories. It makes you feel like, okay, they have invested so much faith in me, so I will make sure that they are heard, and they get access to all the opportunities, all the access to justice, so to speak, that they should get. I think it's a bunch of different things, but staying motivated just comes from the work itself, because the work is involves interacting with people, and when people put so much faith in you, you automatically feel responsible and motivated to continuously, persistently work for them and try and make sure that you support them in whatever way you can.
That's so well put. I mean, if you don't have that kind of passion, then one cannot survive in a field such as yours. And your passion is really coming through, and you're doing it for the right reasons, which also is a mark of good quality education, and also a mark of good upbringing, that you make those choices with a lot of logic and a lot of reasoning, which is truly. I'm truly happy to hear all of that. So, what are you most looking forward to in your professional journey, Yashaswini? Because you have started with the UN and you're having a great experience. As you rightly said, that you have now the experience of working in so many different organizations across the world. So, what are some of the things that you are most looking forward to going forward?
I think I am so right now. I'm a United Nations volunteer with the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, and I'm hoping to grow professionally within the UN system, move up the move up the professional ladder within the system, and of course gain practical experience. So if it's going to be possible for me to access more opportunities in peacekeeping missions or in the field, I would definitely want to choose that, because I think that has given me really good experience in how UN actually works, because the real work of the UN is in the field. So I think that's been really interesting for me, and I'm hoping that in the next 5 years I remain in peacekeeping missions, and gain practical experience.
That
And
is
other than that, I think sorry. Other than that, I just want to get a second master's in public health, but it's currently on the back burner, and I may consider it after a couple of years. But it's definitely something on my mind.
I mean, it's so apt given the current scenario and the future predictions that public health is going to be the next big thing, where all the research and the resources and the kind of investment in terms of the government funding is going to come in, right? And that is rightly so, because if you do not have health, you have nothing, right? And if we are
Yeah.
putting the world's population in a situation wherein if there is a crisis, there's no cure or there's no solution, then what are we really talking about? It is as good as talking about climate change and not doing anything about it. So we need more professionals, more expertise in this area, certainly. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the hollowness of the systems that we have around us, sadly. And
Definitely.
that means there is
Yeah.
a lot more work to be done in this area. And that sounds like a lot to be done in the near future. And I hope you are able to do each of those things and tick them off your list of things. Okay, so
Thank you.
now with that, we have a whole rounded view of what all you have been up to, what all you are looking forward to, and we are now really excited to know about your views on the topic for today's webinar, which is advocacy for social justice, tools, techniques, and challenges. Before we begin that introduction, just a word to the attendees that you can start sending us your questions, and towards the end of this sort of presentation, we are going to take up those questions happily, and Ms. Mittal will be happy to answer those questions. So, may I request you to just share the PowerPoint, and then I'll ask you the first question, Yashaswini.
Sure. Sure. Yes, can you see the PowerPoint?
Uh, yes, it's come up now. Yes. Would you like to
Okay,
make it full
great.
screen? Just do a slideshow. I think that works best.
Sure. Yeah,
Okay, perfect. So I'm able to see it, so the attendees would be able to see it. But I'll just check with everyone. So if some of you could type in the chat and say that you are able to see the PPT, that would be lovely for us. Okay, I think they are able to see it. So my first question to you, Yashaswini, really is that, and we are catering to an audience here who are either aspiring law students or they are in law school right now. And well, advocacy is something, a word that is used quite loosely in our day-to-day lives. But what is the real meaning of advocacy according to you?
sure. Thanks for the question, Shireen. So as you can see, like the meaning of advocacy is essentially any kind of activity done by an individual or a group of individuals to influence decisions within political, economic, and social institutions. Also, advocacy, like in India, when you are admitted as a lawyer, you are called an advocate. Uh, of course, the most common use of advocacy is in courts by a litigator. However, there are different versions of advocacy, which we'll go through during this presentation. And you'll see how advocacy can play out outside the courtroom also in various different ways.
Okay,
So,
that's
yes,
good information that advocacy not necessarily has to happen in courts, which is a common myth, but it could happen even outside the courtrooms. So, what are the different types of techniques or tools that are used for advocacy then?
sure. So, as you can see, there are two kinds of advocacy. I mean, broadly, and I've tried to make this presentation very simple so that it's easily understandable for the audience. So, of course, there is direct advocacy, which happens with victims or affected persons or communities, where lawyers physically visit the communities and victims and engage in advocacy. Then, of course, there is representation of those victims in court. So those are two direct advocacy routes. Then, in terms of indirect advocacy, is essentially with policymakers. If you want to bring about a change in the law or look at how the implementation of the law is skewed and what the parliament or the ministry can do about, or the government, essentially the executive, can do about that issue or that void in the law. Then, of course, there's indirect advocacy through courts as well, which we see in India through public interest litigation. Then there is also, indirect advocacy through the media, which is targeted at the public at large to gain more traction on a particular issue, for which, again, to get the policymakers to also notice that the public at large also believes that this issue needs to be tackled at the policy level. Then, of course, there is also an internal, organizational aspect to advocacy as well. So if I, as a lawyer, decide tomorrow that I want to work on a particular issue and advocate for that issue in different ways, I need to ensure that the funders, suppose I'm working at an organization, then the funders of that organization are also on board that I want to engage in this kind of advocacy. There are also colleagues and peers who perhaps will support me or work with me on that particular issue. I need to advocate for that issue before them also, so that they are also on board when I go about this initiative. And lastly, it's with international bodies where you engage with human rights treaty body mechanisms to advocate for the issue at an international level and bring about change regionally, nationally, or internationally. So, yeah.
Yeah, that sums up and in a very broad way direct advocacy and indirect advocacy and busts a lot of common myths about doing advocacy only through the courts. In fact, in some situations, when you talk about indirect advocacy, it could have a much larger impact on a particular issue as opposed to direct advocacy. And in a way, I think both of them are interrelated because because of the fact that indirect advocacy seeps into what you eventually argue or end up arguing in court. So my
Definitely.
next question to you really, Yashaswini, is with respect to, would you like to, explain us the concept of advocacy and what you're really trying to put through with the help of an illustration?
Sure. So I think that would be really useful. So for instance, we have read in a lot of, if you would have read the news reports recently, you would have seen that many news reports have said that child marriage has, the rate of child marriage has increased in India after the COVID-19 pandemic hit India. And so suppose we take child marriage as an issue and we want to, engage in advocacy on child marriage. So there are, for direct advocacy, the different routes would be, for instance, training and awareness raising on, child marriage within communities, among survivors, having advocates, homegrown advocates within communities who will report if there is a child marriage to the police, or come to the lawyer if there is an incident of child marriage, and report that incident so that it doesn't occur again and there is deterrence. Then, of course, the second part is representation before courts. If an incident of child marriage is reported to a lawyer, the survivor is represented before courts and gets, compensation or, other sort of relief measures that are applicable under the Child Marriage Prevention Act, Prohibition of Child Marriage Act, that is there in India. And then, of course, direct advocacy can also lead to data collection, which can help with the indirect advocacy later. So, collection of narratives, of stories, of, how victims are suffering because of this, because of, gaps in the law, or, just numbers that, in these, in so many places or in so many communities, child marriage is higher than, say, other communities or other villages. So getting all that information can again help with policy making at a broader level. Then moving to indirect advocacy on the same issue. So if we know now after data collection that there is this issue of child marriage, okay, and the reason that it still exists is because the law is clearly ineffective and the reporting mechanism under the law is not good enough, and that there perhaps aren't protections for people who are reporting incidents, maybe survivors or maybe independent members in the community who are reporting incidents. So engaging with policymakers to make sure that the protections within the law are enhanced so that it is effective in practice and actually curbs the practice. Of course, if engaging with policymakers initially does not work, because there are so many issues that the policymakers need to deal with. So sometimes child marriage may not be the most prioritized issue at that point. Maybe COVID-19 may be the most prioritized issue at that point. So then maybe the second option would be filing a public interest litigation, because through the court and directions that the court issues, which are time bound, the policymakers are more under more pressure to then act and do something about the gaps in the law, or maybe a provision in the law which is problematic. Of course, other than public interest litigation, there's also media-based advocacy through which you can get public support for for changing the law. We saw that happening for a lot of our criminal law amendments in recent years, where through news reports, the public were fired up about how the criminal law in India, the penal code, needed to be amended and strengthened. So media-based advocacy is also really, in recent years, it has proven to be very effective as an advocacy tool. And lastly, of course, there are submissions to international bodies where if none of these, solutions have worked, or initiatives have worked, or even if they have worked, to put more pressure on the government, or to put more pressure on the government through an international mechanism. You can make submissions to the human rights committees under different international treaties and have them look at this issue, and then issue a direction or recommendation to India to do something about this practice, and to strengthen the law so that this practice can be stopped. So these are basically the different ways in which one issue like child marriage can be perhaps resolved.
I mean, that's a brilliant way of putting it, that how advocacy in direct and indirect forms can be used for an issue as crucial as a social problem, as crucial as child marriages. So COVID-19 pandemic to an extent has not only brought these issues to the fore, but also has forced us to expedite our solutions as well and apply multi-pronged strategies in order to find a solution to these things. But it is unfortunate that we have so many issues that this exact concept can be applied to and is in fact being applied to, and eventually with serious and with good tools for advocacy, we will be able to at least mitigate some of the damages that happen because of the existence of these problems. And especially, there are toolkits coming up in COVID-19 pandemic to deal with higher education institutions, or how these things should be dealt with, or domestic violence. And I think if not, then for child marriages as well, there should be a special toolkit that is available to NGOs working in this area, or to policymakers, or to, in fact, the implementators on the ground in terms of how to deal with such a scenario where people are engaging in this malpractice. So, with that, now I have a question for you. So it's a natural question to what you've discussed. Basically, now for all of this, you need professionals, you need lawyers who will be facing these challenges in order to be advocates in direct or indirect ways and applying the knowledge of law to the best of their abilities. So, what are some of these challenges that lawyers or legal professionals face when it comes to being advocates for primarily social issues in direct or indirect ways? And what are some of the techniques that they adopt in order to manage those situations?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Shireen. So I think in terms of challenges, the challenge essentially, I think it comes with being a human rights lawyer or working on a public interest issue, is that there will always be setbacks. It's possible that you engage in all of these different ways, advocacy initiatives that I have outlined in my previous slides, and you will still not succeed. You will fail, and you will not be able to garner enough traction on that issue for that issue to be taken up by policymakers and for concrete changes. So, but it's important to not give up despite these failures, and to keep and to get up and to try again, because at the end of the day, child marriage still exists and the practice is continuing. So, if you have failed once, you should not give up. I mean, you should try the next year again. Maybe look at how you can innovate in the way you've been using these different advocacy initiatives. Perhaps do the international engagement before domestic engagement, or perhaps try again with the ministry with more data. So I mean, there are different ways to look at this issue, but setbacks in while advocating for a particular issue should not stop you, and you should continue to continue to advocate for the issue despite setbacks. So I think that's really important. And then, of course, like I mentioned initially, staying motivated and knowing that a lot of people have put faith in you, and that should give you the confidence that survivors have trusted me with their stories, and other supporters have put faith in me. So it's that makes you stay motivated and to continue to press to get the issue resolved at the policy level. Then, of course, like I've already mentioned, innovation is important. And sometimes when you're working on an issue for a really long time, you are unable to think of innovative ideas. So it's important to collaborate with other individuals who may be working on this or some other allied issue, and hear their new ideas, brainstorm with them, test new ideas with them, and deliberate over how, what have been the gaps, why have you failed in the past, and how you can succeed, in the future, and how you can ensure that policymakers pay attention to you. So I think that those are all ways to, to overcome the challenges. And of course, last but not the least, is to celebrate even the smallest victories. Even if you've won a case for one person in court, and the court has issued one line which says that, this is the gap in the law, you can use that for a lot of advocacy at the policy level. So it's important to celebrate that even though it was a small victory, it was just one case in court, it was still impact. You got justice for that one victim, and now you can use that language in that judgment to advocate for larger changes in the law itself. So I think all of these are the different challenges, and of course solutions to these challenges, perhaps to not give up and to just continue with the same perseverance to pursue the issue.
I mean, yes, I mean, that's beautifully put. And I really like the final point, the celebrate small victories, because maybe in all of the enormity of the problem, sometimes we're all human beings, we get lost in the enormity of the problem and we feel that, okay, a little drop in the ocean, is it going to do something for the cause? But as you rightly said, that even a line makes a difference. It makes you move a little step forward in that, in solving that problem. Because if the social problem was so easy, then it would have been solved by now. But because it is multidimensional, it is dynamic, it keeps changing with the changing times. You also need innovation, you need multi-pronged strategies, and you need a lot of will and human determination for constantly challenging the problem itself and finding solutions. And in fact, and I want to bring this up here, and I think it's apt. A lot of when we do human rights work in India or elsewhere in some parts of the world, of course, the Western world is different because it's recognized as a particularly different expert domain and requires a lot of expertise. But mostly in India, you would see that synonyms such as social work, charity, and things like that also come up, which is so wrong. This is just completely different from the practice of international human rights law. And I hope really that that is something that will seep in slowly. And I think through legal aid clinics, where I am mostly involved since my when I was a law student, since my law school days, I've tried to bring that culture that no, this is not social work. This is it's a completely different sort of work. Of course, social work is also great, but international human rights law, human rights work requires a different skill set as opposed to when you talk about social work. And I hope that in our lifetime, Yashaswini and Yashaswini, you and my lifetime, we're able to see that culture develop in India as well. Because you would have seen, since you have worked in organizations not only in India but abroad as well, you would have understand that the attitude to human rights work is sort of different. What do you think about that?
Definitely, I completely agree with that. In fact, I think when I was in the US, I actually thought that public interest law is a field of law. And, people pursue that stream in law school thinking we will do public interest law. We are a public interest law fellow. So I think that kind of distinction, we don't really recognize that in India. And of course, when I talk about human rights with my family members who are slightly older, they also make it a simplistic way. I mean, they describe it in a very simplistic way that, oh, she's just engaging in social work. But it's not that. There are so many different nuances to it, and it's challenging, yet it's really, really rewarding. And I think that even if I am not working on public interest law, even if I'm a corporate lawyer, knowing how advocacy works and how different policy changes can be brought is still important, because even as a corporate lawyer, laws affect me. Law reform affects me. If a law which is not evidence based is has been passed by parliament, it is going to affect me as a corporate lawyer. Just to give you an example, we have a law where the bouncing of a check is a criminal offense. Now, suppose as a corporate lawyer, as a corporate litigator, I have been representing a lot of clients in court because, they have criminal cases against them for, check bouncing. And, I know a couple of other people who are advocating for, making check bouncing a civil offense. So, those policy changes affect me, and I can use some of the work that I'm doing, the data I've collected, and the narratives that I have to strengthen that those representations before Parliament that, hey, we need that change because we have so much judicial pendency. We don't need extra cases in criminal courts over check bouncing. They can be civil, they can go through the civil route instead. So this is just a small example, but I think public interest law is very broad. Policy advocacy is again very broad. It affects all of us. Even if I'm a human rights lawyer, corporate lawyer, it affects us. So I think it's important for students, law students and young lawyers to realize that, because and to learn those issues, learn those skills so that they can use them in whatever capacity in their legal career.
That's a very important point you made, and especially for law students, they shouldn't, confine themselves to a particular area too early in their careers. They should explore, experiment through internships, read up on the subject of their choice outside class, and then take an informed decision about where they truly fit in, because of the fact that you would excel only where your true interest lies. And we have seen it through the examples of all of our lives. We have tried to do different things, and finally we do something that interests us, and then life takes us to different sort of journeys. So that's a very important point that you have made. And this whole debate between corporate law and human rights law, and keeping them in the opposite spectrums, is something that is so archaic now. I feel that you have the concept of business and human rights now. You have that field is emerging. That field is now sort of developed around the world, and they go hand in hand. So if it's a corporate lawyer, or it's a human rights lawyer, or if you're an environmental lawyer, or you do something else as a lawyer, the idea is that laws affect each one of us, and skill set is something that is interchangeable across the fields of law. Knowledge is something that is subject specific, which is a great learning for any law student. That's something that you learn over the years. So having the background of what advocacy is, how advocacy can be used in different ways, how it is a rewarding career with its challenges. Law is a rewarding career, and advocacy really is a tool, are the tools and techniques for you to really excel in your practice, whether it is policy work or otherwise. Why do you think that lawyers should engage in advocacy, and what does it really serve? What purpose does it really serve in the promotion of a cause, according to you?
So I think, and this is the most simplistic answer. I think advocacy in different forms, like I've discussed the different ways of advocacy. I think at the end of the day, they help with, reforming the law or evolving the law. So you have a law, and right now, when I talk about the law, I mean the text of the law. Textual. Having a statute, for instance. So like child marriage, you have a statute already. It's been several years since we've had a statute. We have a minimum age of marriage and all of that. However, we still have, this practice which prevails in different parts of India. So having this, engaging in advocacy helps you to sort of understand, okay, this law exists, but clearly its enforcement is weak. What are the reasons for it? And then you can evolve the law. Maybe the courts can interpret the law in a way that ensures that this practice is curbed on the ground, or Parliament can, consider amendments to this law so that it's strengthened, and it's evidence based. By evidence based, I mean evidence on whatever's happening on the ground, in communities where this practice still exists. Get evidence from there that these are different reasons why it exists, because people are scared to report it. They fear retaliation from their communities, or they fear for their life. So how can you ensure? So this is the evidence, and how can you ensure that the law strengthens these protections so that people who do report, they get protection under the law, and they get protective measures put in place so that they don't fear retaliation. They or their families don't fear retaliation. So I think advocacy at the end of the day just helps the law become better in serving the needs of the people, needs of the communities, and just strengthening the rule of law in any country, I think.
That is a very valid point, and that is something that young people should definitely think about, because you are in a way shaping the world that you're going to live in, or the one that your children are going to inherit from you, in a way, right? But we seldom think about these aspects when it comes to choosing careers, and we go with the best option that is available to us. Something like this requires a lot of life experience, and life experience can come at an early age as well, as it has come to you. And then boldness of decision, because I know that when you don't fall in line in terms of choosing a straightforward career, there's a lot of opposition from your family. Your friends don't agree with your choices, so in a way you're alone in that journey, taking that leap of faith, or in better words, taking that risk, and working at it for it to pay off. And finally it is rewarding. That is what I can see from your journey as well. But all in all, I think from your experience, what young students can take up, or young lawyers, or people who are in careers who that are not fulfilling to them, because everyone has their own calling, should really take a step back, think about what is it that truly works for them, and then go for it with a very practical approach, do the right internships, um, develop their knowledge, develop their skill set, and then apply for those jobs that are truly meant for them, and then give themselves time to groom themselves into those roles. So thank you for that presentation, Yashaswini. That was deeply deeply enhanced our knowledge, and also our idea of opened up our minds to the idea of advocacy and what all its potential is. And especially in a developing country like ours, we need a lot of advocacy on a number of issues. Of course, some of these issues are global in nature, and even if you have international conventions and treaties and you have a lot of international dialogue, unless it comes to us in a form of a domestic law and then seeps into the grassroots, is something that would really lead to a change. Otherwise, it wouldn't. So now I'll start taking questions from the audience, and there are a couple of questions about. The first question that I really want to ask you is, and that's something that Mr. Kishore has asked of you, that what do you think are the similarities or differences in advocacy methods in India, US, and Sudan, according to you?
So I think, thanks for the question, Kishore. And I think, I don't think there are any differences, which is why I can broadly classify them the way I did in the presentation. I think it's a mix of both, depending on where you're located. In India, for instance, grassroots advocacy is really effective, where you engage in awareness raising programs within communities, tell them about the law, tell them how the legal avenues they can access if they see a violation of the law, or if they're a victim of a violation. So and of course in India also, like engaging with parliamentarians, many of them are open-minded and want to listen to an external person who's not working within the government, and what they have to say, and and the data that they have on a particular issue. And sometimes independent members of parliament are interested in taking up a particular issue, and they draft an independent private member's bill and introduce it in parliament for deliberation. So again, there are different ways that advocacy works in different countries. However, broadly, the avenues of advocacy are the same. So I don't think they're different. Of course, in the US, the parliamentary system is a bit more complex. But again, it's the same process, direct and indirect, and parliamentarians, and grassroots, and then of course all the other things in between. So yeah, so that would be my response.
So the basics remain the same. It's just that the implementation and the people implementing it, the mode, the cultural context, all of that changes. But the basic skill set of advocacy truly remains the same, and with the objective of advocating for better policies, better laws, and really better implementation of those policies and laws. Another attendee of ours has a very interesting question for you. It's a two-part question. Firstly, his name is Dheeraj, and he's asking you that how advocacy at the UN is different from courtroom advocacy, and what are the factors which affect advocacy at United Nations?
Sure. Thank you, Neeraj, for the question. So I think, of course, courtroom advocacy is like I think the way we understand, arguing in court. Basically, you have a client, you represent the client, and based on your research and the facts that the client tells you, you represent the client's interests in court and try to the best of your ability to fight for the client's interests and get a favorable judgment. UN-based advocacy is essentially, it means engaging with the UN's treaty body mechanisms, or engaging with the UN's different departments to get international consensus on the particular issue, so that the particular country, for instance, you're working on getting a law change in India, changed in India. So you get international sort of pressure on India to change that law, because the UN recognizes, that human rights need to be respected, protected, and fulfilled by every country, every government. And so, and then you advocate for the UN to perhaps issue a press release or issue a resolution saying that, this particular law needs to be changed by this particular country, and in this case, India. And then you go to policy makers saying that, see, internationally, you've been told that, you should perhaps consider changing this law, and you're getting a lot of international sort of flack, if you're not going to change it. So perhaps you should consider changing it, modifying it at least, doing something about it, or deliberating it in parliament. So these are all different ways to create pressure on governments to at least deliberate over a particular law and try and modify it, change it, strengthen it, so that the particular issue that you are advocating for can get resolved in some shape or form.
That sounds lovely, and that sounds like a well-rounded answer to the question that was asked. So there's a question by Shubhankar, who's one of our attendees, and he's asking you that when we have courts, we have domestic law in terms of child marriages, and it's a malpractice, of course, it's a social problem. How do you get the courts to enforce judgments when it comes to child marriages in India? Because you do have that kind of law, and of course it has to do with the rule of law and the implementation and how it really works. But what do you think is the best way forward when it comes to curbing child marriages in India, and the courts or the judiciary's role in doing so?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Shubhankar. So I think this is a big problem in India, actually, which is enforcement of judgment. Now, of course, if you have a district court giving a judgment, the enforcement of judgment has to be done by law enforcement and, of course, court officers. And if, the court, and if suppose the judgment is issued by the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is in Delhi, okay, and say the judgment is about some remote village in Haryana. Of course, Haryana and Delhi are not very far, but the Supreme Court can't personally go and ensure that the judgment is enforced in that particular village in Haryana. The only way this can be done is through courts, through law enforcement, and lawyers who get that judgment go to law enforcement, say that, hey, I can see that in this village it's still happening. This is the judgment, and I want you to come with me and ensure that there is compliance here. And whoever's not complying, tell them that legal action will be taken against them. So I think that is a big problem in India, at a large scale, not just when it comes to child marriage. It also affects like environmental issues, where environmental law judgments are also not implemented on the ground. So that's an issue, and that needs to be tackled at, again, a policy level, because it's a systemic issue that judgments are just not enforced unless you're a powerful person, or or there is a strong law enforcement presence in that area. So yeah.
Yes, definitely, and that's very well put, that it's not only to do with the child marriages, the cases or the decisions in child marriage cases, but the decisions all across when it comes to environmental laws, when it comes to laws, even some commercial matters for that matter, even for land disputes, and enforceability is a huge issue because of the scale of this country and the condition of the justice system. And we cannot deny the fact that there are judicial delays and there are a lot of judicial vacancies as well. Today in the COVID-19 pandemic, you have sort of digitization of the courts, but here also, if you look at it, high courts and Supreme Courts have taken the leap forward. I mean, they have taken that, they've adapted to technology, but if you look at the lower courts, they're still the same. They haven't adapted to technology, and all of this does seep into the kind of justice that we're getting from the courts and the pace at which we are getting it. So another question that has come our way from one of the students is Mehek. She has asked you about your internships. She's really fascinated about how did you get to do so many amazing internships during law school. So it's like a long email I've received, so I'll try to break it down. So the first question that she really wants to know is that how did you decide to intern in these places, the UN internships in particular? Second, how did you go about applying for them? And third, how was your experience of interning at these organizations? Yes.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Mehek. So I think, like I said, when I came to law school, I knew that I wanted to, intern with the UN and eventually work with the UN on human rights. So whenever I spoke to, my professors at JGLS and, spoke to the career department, the career services cell in our law school at the time, I told them that that was my preference, to either get something in human rights, or if possible then work with a United Nations department in New Delhi. And luckily at the time I was able to Jindal offered me the to work with UNHCR. There was an interview process, and after the interview process, after interviewing several candidates, I was selected, and then I did the internship for 2 months. And then again, even for the UN Criminal Court in Rwanda, again, there was an interview process. In fact, there was an email sent by a professor to the entire college saying that this internship was perhaps available, and if anyone was interested, to send her an essay, a writing sample, your resume, and short letter of motivation. And I did that, and then again there was an interview process, and then I was selected from Jindal along with another colleague to go for this internship. So I think I just got lucky, because in Jindal these opportunities were available, and I had already upfront told all my professors and career services cell that I was interested in these opportunities. So it just sort of, all things just fell into the right place at the right time for me personally. Yeah.
Okay. So you have been a go-getter in that sense, and I've seen you do that in law school and otherwise as well. So you have made it clear, and it's also the law of attraction that you said that this is what I want, and then you didn't sit idle, you acted upon it. So you made it clear to all the professors that this is what I'm looking at, and whenever there was an opportunity, you meritoriously got it by interviewing for it, and then following through that. Because if your internship would have not gone so well, then they wouldn't have recommended you the second time. And this is important for students to understand, that it's not only important to secure an opportunity, but also to make the best use of it by giving it your all. So that's really nice learnings for the students, how to secure internships, and then how to follow up with those internships in a way that you get recommended again and again. One of the students one of the attendees has asked you a question about your LLM. So Apurva has asked you that how did you end up doing global health law, and what is the scope in terms of career opportunities for somebody who has a specialization in global health law in India as well as abroad?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think there are many options for someone who has done a master's in global health law, especially post COVID-19. There are a lot of opportunities to work with government. So for instance, in the government of India, under the Ministry of Health, they have a legal resource center on health specifically. And they hire lawyers, sometimes they hire consultants, and they essentially work on reforming different health laws and looking at how enforcement of different health laws works out in practice. So that is one option, to work with government. Then of course engage in research in different ways. For instance, WIDI, Center for Legal Policy, it engages with government but also conducts independent research on health issues. So that is one option. Different think tanks or policy institutes or organizations that are working on public health or looking at health and law, basically looking at these two issues together. And then also in different national laws, in different law schools. So for instance, NLU Delhi, I have heard recently, has set up a health law center. Then even NLSIU Bangalore has a health law cell, I believe. So there are these different options. So either it could be pure academic research, or it could be policy work, again engaging with government, or working with policy think tank to work, to look at different health issues. Then also there are civil society organizations, and I'm using these different terms because a policy think tank and a civil society organization are two different things. Civil society organization does more of grassroots work, engages in some policy work. A policy think tank only does policy work, does not really do grassroots work. And by grassroots, I mean actually go out to the different rural or urban areas, urban settings, where health issues play out in practice. So, so civil society organizations also, you can work as a lawyer and, look at different issues that play out on the ground, represent victims in courts, or advocate for victims before, state human rights commissions, national human rights commission. And, there are different avenues, there are different, ways to deal with the problem. And lastly, of course, work with an international organization, World Health Organization, or, United Nations Human Rights Commission, and look at health and law and how it intersects with other issues. So, yeah.
I mean, that's great. In fact, what you've summed up is not only the opportunities that are available in the area of global health law, but in a way you have also covered public health, because both of them are sort of, interacting with each other in many ways. And in fact, what is most important is that, like other research topics, for example, some of the research areas are quite saturated in terms of a lot of research has been done, and what is lacking is implementation. But when you talk about global health or you talk about public health, so many issues are unfolding as we are living through them, and therefore that requires a lot of research, that requires a lot of innovation, fresh thinking, fresh perspective, and there is where the opportunity is. You could in fact become a pioneer in some of those topics if you choose something of your interest and write about it, work in that area, and then world organizations will be looking at you for your expertise, because you would have that empirical data and you would have analyzed the literature around the issue. So that falls for a lot of opportunities in these various organizations and various ways in which you can use your knowledge. So it's really about knowledge and skill set at the end of the day, I always tell my students, and that's what one realizes after working for a while. Um, so one of the attendees have also asked you that, so it's a student and it's a concern. So basically a high school student who wants to is aspiring to pursue law, but his or her, because it's an anonymous attendee, his or her concern really is that, he's not very good at rote learning, and he or she would like to pursue a career in law, but does not know if law school is all about rote learning or is there something else to it. I think he has he or she has this idea that in high school our education system is always about rote learning. So is that something that is going to deter his or her chances of becoming a successful lawyer? So your take on that?
Thank you for the question. And I think, Shireen, you would agree with me when I say this, that actually going to Jindal was really useful in that sense, because we did not, do rote learning in Jindal at all. Like I mentioned earlier during the webinar, our professors, made us really think. Our exams weren't based on whether we can write a particular provision from a particular statute, exactly the way it is in the statute. Our professors just wanted us to apply the law and see if we can, if there is a fictitious situation, how we apply that particular provision of law and whether it applies to that situation or not. So I think rote learning is not really necessary to succeed as a lawyer. Of course, it's and you always have access to memos or written documents whenever you are making representations as a lawyer before different bodies. So it's not like you don't have access to the number of the provision or the name of the statute when you're making representations. So learning them up or mugging them up is not really important. What is just important is critical thinking and to be able to apply the law to real life or practical situations.
Exactly, and that's I completely agree with you, and that is something that is unfortunately not followed across all educational institutions. But Jindal really emphasizes on it, that you have to develop critical research, writing, thinking skills, and that's what a lawyer is truly paid for. I mean, you're paid for adding to what the law is, rather applying it to different situations, rather than telling what the law really is. You need to know what the law is, but then
Exactly.
beyond that, how do you apply it? How do you use it to the advantage of your client? How do you use it for advocacy? How do you use it for solving social issues? Is what is key to the profession of law. And this is something internationally people recognize, but when it comes to India, only a few educational institutions unfortunately have been able to embody that kind of teaching. And of course, we know that the primary school education or the secondary school education or the higher secondary school education, and we have gone through it, and we have come out of it, but we also know that too much emphasis on rote learning is something that we have all faced in our board exams, etc. And now the new education policy is a turnaround on that, and hopefully the next generation of students are going to invest time in developing key research writing and thinking skills from an early on age, as opposed to going to law school and learning it and then applying it in their careers, which we did. And of course we struggled also, Yashaswani, let's be honest, we struggled
Yeah.
both from science backgrounds, and when you come from a science background, you're always thinking of equations, and you're talking about, you're coming from organic chemistry to a lecture in sociology, and you're like, okay, this is a different world for me. I mean, I never thought about this, and we were never exposed to that subject. For me, for example, I really loved the sociology lectures in the first few years, and that really opened up a world for me to understand, okay, these things can also be studied, and the world around you is actually quite fascinating. So similar to your experience, humanities is something that appealed to me more than science, and I'm glad that I made that switch after school to pursue law. And things which a law school, which you really learn in law school and which you can use in your career, are those key skills. And actually to add to the anxiety, I mean to lessen the anxiety of that aspiring law student, I would like to say that no worries, you don't have to learn things. What you have to do is you have to be logical about things, and automatically things will flow in the right direction. So that was a great question, I feel. So now, taking a step forward and understanding about a United Nations assignment right now and later on, a lot of the attendees prior to the webinar as well as during the webinar have raised this question that how can they enter the system, how can they prepare themselves to enter the UN system, and what is it that a UN job or a UN volunteering position entails for them.
Okay, thanks for the question, Shireen. So I think there is no one way to enter the system. I think I've met a lot of corporate lawyers who work for 5 years and then enter the system, or I've met someone like me who has only done work with a policy think tank and then worked with advocacy organizations and then enter the system. So there is not one single way to enter the system. You can, depending on the job description, depending on what you apply for, what you are interested in, you can enter the system in many different ways. And also the UN has all kinds of roles. Okay, there is business and human rights, there are purely corporate legal counsel kind of roles as well, like UN's legal department, Office of Legal Affairs, which basically is a legal counsel to the UN. So any of the issues, legal issues that the UN has to deal with, they advise the UN on that. So those are all different routes that can be taken to join the United Nations. There's no one single route. In terms of skills, again, like depending on the job that you're looking for, what you are interested in, you can, acquire the skills that are of interest to you, or that are presented to you, after law school. Or I think it's just about luck and about what you want to pursue at the end of the day, more than joining the UN, because you will get, if you are interested in the UN, you will get there. But I think the subject matter and where your interest and passion lies is more important. And once you are good at that, you're recognized to be good by your supervisors and by your organization wherever you're working, you can join the UN, because then you become an asset to the organization. So I mean, I don't think there is one single way, but yes, only one skill that I would recommend to young lawyers, which they can perhaps acquire, which will improve their chances of working with the UN, is to learn a different language, is to either learn a UN language, which is French, or learn any of the other 4 or 5 different languages of the UN. because that improves the chances to get into the UN. Most Indian lawyers who apply, they usually don't know another language, and that is always an issue. So that would be my only recommendation specifically, that learn a new language and be proficient in it, because that will help your chances.
I mean, that's a really good point. And in fact, because you're operating as a global citizen, your colleagues are from all across the world. So that kind of an experience is something that is truly unique in terms of working in an international organization. The platform that you get is amazing. So the change that you can make is also probably going to have a larger impact. Your work is going to have a larger impact, and it's like passing the baton to the next person who is taking a position, and you keep moving forward. And the issue and the kind of work that you're doing, every person contributes to the betterment of the situation, which is great. In fact, I would say to anyone who wants to apply to the UN as an internship, in an internship role or a job, is to please go and visit the UN website, research thoroughly what are the positions available, and see where you fit, what level you are at, where you need to get at. And they are pretty clear with their requirements, right? That they would want certain things from an individual, some prerequisites, and see what they're looking at, and probably start working in that direction. You might be already there, you might not be already there, but you can certainly start moving in the direction in which the UN is looking their candidates to be at. I think that should be an important. I think people don't research enough for the positions that they apply for, and these people who are sort of assessing applications are very well experienced, and they're seasoned people, and they know who has done the research and who hasn't. And fortunately or unfortunately, they just have that piece of paper to judge your capabilities, and later on maybe you have an interview for some of the positions, but for some of them you might not even have an interview. So the idea truly is to make your applications in a very concise and apt manner, so that you get invited for that interview and then finally end up at the UN. But even before that, one has to answer the question for themselves, that why the UN, why now? And then the resolve would become stronger and more sort of determinative. Another thing that Yashaswini, I would like to just quickly add here is that sometimes, what students do, they think that, okay, if I get into the UN, whether I'm going to join, or why not somewhere else? So I always tell them that you cross the bridge once you reach there. So if you are interested in 100 things, apply for those 100 things. Who is stopping you? And once you have the call letter, you have some kind of an opportunity in your hand, you can decide where do you want to go. So a lot of thinking and procrastination leads to the fact that you don't end up applying. And I'm sure it has happened in your case, in my case as well, that we've thought of a particular thing, but when we ended up doing it, it has been a couple of years by the time that we have tried to do it, just because of the fact that we overthink those things. So there's a question, there's another question from Mehek, our attendee. Then we have got so many questions. So this question is really about the status of international law in countries, because they are sovereign nations and international law is something that has limited jurisdiction, etc. So our question is more from a public international law perspective, that international law ultimately is soft law, it's not binding. So then does it make sense? And this is a question all of us have thought of at some point when we were in law school. So when it's not binding on us, then what is the point? And it's soft law, then does it make sense to go for a career in international law? The other way to put it is really that a career in international law, whether it gives you enough opportunities to work in India. Yeah.
Sure. I think this is a misconception among many young, students and lawyers that international law is, soft law, so it's not binding and there is no point in pursuing a career in it. But the point is that if a country like India, for instance, signs an international treaty, it is bound by it. It internationally makes a statement by signing the treaty that I am, making a commitment that I'm going to be bound by the provisions of this treaty. So domestically, if you work in a civil society organization or with a policy think tank, or you work in government, or any of the other capacities, you can use that country's commitment globally into the domestic work that you're doing to push for different issues or causes that you are working on. So again, coming back to the child marriage example, India has signed CEDAW, CEDAW, which is a convention on elimination of discrimination against women. Okay. That CEDAW and as well as ICCPR, which is International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Both these conventions read together give the person advocating for prohibition on child marriage to use the commitments that India has made globally to say that India has made a commitment globally that it will stop these practices. In addition to, of course, the data collection and the other advocacy initiatives that I've already mentioned, you can also use global, commitments made by India to get general public to take notice of this issue, that how this is a big issue in India, and India is, publicly, globally, it is, trying to become a stronger power and, trying to improve as a nation, improve its rule of law, democracy, etc. So there are these different angles to it. There is a lot of politics involved, lobbying involved, diplomacy involved. But it's definitely worth it. I mean, and all of them require you to have legal skills, because all of them require you to apply the law or use the law in some shape or form. So I think it would be very simplistic to say that just because international law is soft law and these treaties, and to say that these treaties don't hold much value. These treaties actually hold a lot of value. Countries don't want to have trade relations with another country that is violating their treaty obligations, or getting shamed internationally for violating the treaty obligations can lead to a bunch of different sanctions against the country's highest officials. So there are different routes to ensure that international law is implemented, especially treaties. And again, domestically also there are different ways to implement international law. So I wouldn't say, so I would actually say that going for a career in international law would be worth it, because you will be looking at the law from, a global lens, a national lens, a subnational lens, and all of that is really useful for your personal and professional development.
Yes, that's beautifully put. And in fact, Yashaswini, we have seen that Indian courts often cite international judgments, and they cite judgments not only from other foreign jurisdictions, but also from international courts in order to make sense of the treaty obligations, and they're taken quite seriously within the constitution. You have inbuilt provisions for implementing or for uh, for fulfilling your obligation when you ratify or sign a treaty internationally. And of course, international human rights law is not something that any country can take lightly, and UN also reviews your human rights situation every couple of years. You have that mechanism within the UN in order to review your human rights situation. And in terms of even business investors, look at those reports in order to understand whether it is a feasible decision to invest in a country, because they don't want to invest in a country where human rights practices are bad, or there are rampant human rights abuses, because they have certain ethics that they would like to follow with respect to ethical businesses, etc. So in fact, even if it's soft law, it's not weak law. It has real consequences for our country. And maybe 10 years back, international law was still emerging within the Indian context in Indian legal circles. Of course, you had stalwarts, I say emerging in a loose manner. People were just warming up to the idea, but today you have a very well developed practice, and you have a lot of avenues to work in this area, and it's actually rewarding. Not only I mean, it's lucrative as well, because you're bringing in expertise in a particular area, and there are niche areas within international law which you can develop an expertise on and become consultants in those areas for organizations, companies, or other interested players in the market. So you really have to understand what your interest is, and then invest your time in developing expertise in that area. So it would be just too simplistic, as Yashaswini rightly put, to brush it off as something that doesn't have implementation. So we're glad that we were able to bust that myth for you and for some others. And the courts, Indian courts, recognize international law so much in the judgments that, of course, it's all mainstream now. So the last two questions for today's webinar are really, firstly, there are a number of high school students who are at the brink of choosing their careers and choosing a law school to study law from. So, what do you think are some of the things that potential law students should look for in a law school where they're going to invest 5 years or 3 years of their time?
Thanks for the question. So I think, like when I was choosing Jindal, for instance, and I think choosing again, making any kind of choice is a very personal thing. So I can't. I mean, I'm not sure how I can tell another person how to make a particular choice, but I'll just give an example of how I made that choice, and perhaps that may be useful for young students who are going to make that choice. So when I was choosing Jindal, like I mentioned, I knew that I wanted to work on human rights in some capacity or the other. Jindal, when I saw Jindal's brochure and I saw some of the faculty that were at Jindal, I realized that international law and human rights would definitely be a part of the different courses that will be offered at the university. I had spoken with Professor Rajkumar. I had told him that I am interested in working at the UN at some point, and and I saw that there were a bunch of different collaborations with universities, including UNU, which is a United Nations university at that point. And so I realized that Jindal would be a good choice for me because I would be offered all of these different subjects, and I would have access to opportunities to perhaps intern with the UN or work with the UN in some or the other capacity. Lastly, I think it was also the fact that I was the inaugural batch. So because of that, it's a double-edged sword. Being an inaugural batch also means that you have a clean slate, and you and your batchmates can decide how you want this law school to perhaps be for the other batches. But it's also like you have no one else to look up to. You don't have any seniors, so you have to learn along the way what kind of senior you want to be and how you want to shape this law school as you go on in your pass 1 year after another 5 years. So I think for me personally, I thought it was a good thing that we were the inaugural batch, because we got the opportunity to do many things which were great learning experiences for all of us. And I have seen that has shaped the university in many ways, some of the steps that we took early on. So I think that was also very useful for me. And lastly, of course, I was offered a tuition fee award, which was really beneficial for me, because I could not pay the entire tuition fee, and I was grateful for that award. And because of that award, I was able to study at Jindal for 5 years. So yeah, for me, these were the different things.
And that's a great list for anybody who's trying to choose a law school, especially during these times. So, what is your advice, Yashaswini, to a law student who is currently looking for a career in international law? What are some of the things that the law student should invest his or her time doing, and maybe mooting, internships, publications, or other activities? What would your thoughts be on that?
I think it would be a combination of everything, because every single activity that you do in law school is giving you a different skill set, and all of these skill sets you have to use as a lawyer. You have to be able to speak, you have to be able to research, you have to be able to write, and you have to be able to negotiate, interact with clients, be respectful, all of that. So I think it's important to strike a balance in terms of mooting, debating, researching, writing, internships, everything, so that by the end of law school, you have all of these different experiences that have shaped you and made you acquire a few skills that will help you again in your first job. Again, you can't acquire all the skills in law school itself. Some skills you only acquire after you graduate and you get into your first job. And again, I think you can keep acquiring skills throughout your life. I mean, I know I don't have many skills right now, which I'm still acquiring. So at the end of the day, it's about just finding the balance, and whatever law school has to offer, you try and do everything so that you learn something or the other new from all of these different activities, which will eventually help you in your career as a lawyer at some point.
Okay, that's amazing. Those are amazing ideas. In fact, I tell a lot of my students that you should try different things, and eventually you'll find that you'll have limited time and you'll end up gravitating towards that activity that you like the most, and that becomes your natural choice. So let the activity decide for you that what is it that you really want to do, because though you could be investing a lot of time, but then you have to maintain your grades, you have to do other stuff as well. But getting that exposure is key for you to even say that, okay, this is not something that I don't like, this is something I don't like. So Yashaswini, some of the attendees had a question that how important are publications when you are in law school, because students these days, especially law students, stress a lot about publications while they are at law school, and they're just in a hurry to publish in any journal that is available or accepts their article. And I'm just speaking in a broad manner. Of course, there are quality journals as well where student publications do get accepted. But what is your take on that? Is it about the number of publications? Is it about the quality? Or should students invest a lot of time doing this while they're at law school?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So, I, for one, did not have any publications in law school. I think now, in my career as a lawyer in the past 5 to 6 years since I graduated, I've realized that, okay, it's important to publish. It's okay to have a few publications. But what is really important is the quality of the publications. Maybe as a young student, you feel that having 10 publications is going to look great on my CV. Maybe it will get you an LLM application, get into a great LLM school. But in the long run, the quality of your publications and where you've published, that really matters. And if you have published something which is which is more descriptive, if the paper is not the publication is not really well researched, or it's not of great quality, then in the long run, employers who will look at those publications, it could perhaps have a negative effect on your application. So it's important to be basically everything that you do in the long run. Just think 5 years down the line, am I going to be proud of this? Whatever you publish, if you are just for the sake of publishing, if you publish it today and then 5 years down the line, you read that article and you're like, oh my God, like, I can't believe I wrote this. So, and that can happen to some people. Like I didn't publish anything, but I wrote many research papers in college. And now when I read those research papers, I'm glad I didn't publish them because they were horrible. So, because again, I was still learning as a lawyer. My legal writing wasn't great. My legal analysis wasn't, good enough at that point. So I'm glad I didn't publish at that point. And then gradually, when I started working at Vidhi, I was able to work on my writing, get better at it. And then I published a few things. I felt proud of those publications, and I put it in my resume, and all my employers have read them. So I think it's important to strike a balance. Yes, maybe have a few publications. It's not bad to have them, but then ensure that the quality is excellent.
Exactly. I completely embody what you've said, and I completely, accept what you've said, because I think the most important learning from what you've said is that don't be in a hurry to publish anything. You have to be proud of the work that you have done. You should know that this is the best that can be done at that point. Of course, there is scope for improvement further on as well, because it's going to stay there for eternity, and so it might as well be good, because it carries your name on it. And also not stressing as much about publications, because rightly, I mean, in law school we did not stress so much about publications. Of course, times have changed a little bit now, but still hurrying into publications is not going to help you in any way. So maybe one or two good publications outweigh 10 publications which are not in sort of good reputed journals. Okay, Yashaswini, with that, our webinar for today has come to its end. And before we leave, I would like to thank you for taking out the time to speak to all of us today, to the legal fraternity at large, about such an important topic. We at OB Jindal Global University are really proud of you, the kind of work that you're doing, and the fact that you had a dream and you made it reach the logical end. And the end is just the beginning for you, right? But it seems like it's a full circle. It seems like things are possible, and that has happened to a number of our alumni. But it's feels special because it's happened to a friend, and I'm really glad that you are able to do the kind of work that you are set out to achieve in spite of all the hurdles, and therefore you are an example for people who are trying to do the same. What you really do is, for me, and I would say that we read this line in law school somewhere, that law is a tool for promoting social justice, and I think you are living it day in and day out, and that's wonderful to sort of see, because when we are in law school we think that who's going to do this kind of work, and certainly Yashaswani is doing that kind of work, and that makes you feel that okay, you can do the same degree and still come out with such different and diverse career paths, and you would agree that all our batchmates are doing such different work, and that makes me feel really happy that you were able to do what you set out to do. Today, what you have
Thank
really
you.
done
Thank
is
you.
you have introduced such young minds to the idea of advocacy, the idea that it can be a legit career, because to give it legitimacy in India, and I don't mean it in any other way, but the idea that it is a legit career. There are jobs out there. Go research, and they are lucrative. They are not something that fall in another domain. They fall in the domain of legal expertise, and one can really pursue them. So you have introduced them to this great idea of pursuing a career in international law, told them about opportunities in India as well as abroad, and made them think about the larger role of law in society, which is to actually promote the idea of social justice. So we welcome you back for any webinar that you would like to organize in the future. Whenever you feel you have something to share with us, your case studies, your field experience, which I feel that will start once the COVID-19 pandemic really settles down a bit, and you will get that opportunity to step out in the field and gain much more experience. And we would love to hear about that in the future, and that would really encourage a lot of students to take up this kind of work. Thank you so much, Yashaswani. You have been great today. And to the attendees, thank you for being so lovely and for asking so many questions of us. Some of you have been writing whether this will be available somewhere. It will be available on the JGU page on YouTube, JGU channel on YouTube in a couple of days, and you can access it there. You can also write to Yashaswani. She's quite accessible, approachable, and friendly, and she will answer your questions, because you can see how passionate she is about her work, and also because she understands how difficult it is for young people to come up and to really bring their dream into make their dream into reality. So I'm sure Yashaswani will be happy to do that. With that, the webinar is ended, and I would just ask Yashaswani to for a closing comments, please.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Thank you for having me. It's really great to connect again with you and to have this conversation. And I am also glad that I was able to do this through Jindal, because JGLS again is close to my heart, and I'm glad that I was able to come back and share some of my experience. Although I'm still a young professional, I don't believe I'm very old, but share some tips and some of my experience thus far that perhaps will be useful for the students and audience that attended the webinar today. So yes, like Shireen mentioned, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Please write to me. Perhaps Shireen can share my email address with the students, or you can even write to me over LinkedIn. I'm available on LinkedIn. So I look forward to hearing from you and keeping in touch. And good luck with all your career choices and whatever paths you decide to follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, and have a nice evening, all of you. Thank you, Yashaswani.
Thank you. Thanks.